Excellent to be here. I really never thought that I would find such an appropriate place to present this research for the first time. The title is How Meditation Induces a Cessation of Consciousness, and this is research that I've conducted mostly with Professor Helene Slagter during my postdoc, though I'm now a lecturer at Southern Cross University. And it's going to take a bit of a turn from where we've been so far, because my approach to nothingness in this case is much more empirical, it's scientific, and I'm very interested in the phenomenology of practitioners who actually enter these states, how that affects their mind and brain, and how is it that these sort of assumed nothingness that is our biology gives rise to those kinds of experiences. So to start with, just a few interesting anecdotes or examples. On the 11th of June 1963, a Vietnamese monk, Thich Quang Duc, committed self-immolation in protest against the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese Catholic government. John F. Kennedy said that no news picture in history has generated so much emotion around the world as this one. So a bit of a content warning for the next slide. I'm going to present an image of this, so if you don't want to see this, look away in 3, 2, 1. So this image is of course emotionally and viscerally disturbing, but it's also really disturbing from the perspective of evolution. How is it that someone can go so against all the evolutionary impulses of feeling, action, and perception to choose to light themselves on fire and then withstand such a horrific experience and also end their lives in the process? So it illustrates that humans are capable of voluntarily overriding fundamental impulses of perception, feeling, and action that aid survival. And there's many examples of this from different traditions. So the renowned contemplative Ramana Maharshi was so absorbed in meditation that he was completely oblivious of his body and the world. Insects chewed away portions of his legs, his body wasted away because he was rarely conscious enough to eat, and his hair and fingernails grew to unmanageable lengths. A return to a normal physical condition was not completed for several years. When he was discovered, food had to be placed in his mouth to prevent him from starving. And this was all presumably somehow contemplative meditation induced. So the question arises, how are cases like this possible? And I think there's two intuitive explanations for how someone can undergo experiences like this. One is that they're somehow coping with the arising of the pain and the suffering in the body, that they've somehow reached such a state of consciousness that they're able to cope with what they're experiencing. The other possibility is that they're somehow actually stopping or preventing or unfabricating the arising of pain in the body. And I'm going to suggest that it is more likely that it's something like the second option that's going on here. So the fading away, cessation of experience is emphasized in particular in Buddhist meditation, but other traditions as well. So Robert Bay is a much loved contemporary teacher of meditation who talks about these states as someone who actually undergoes them, but he also quotes a lot from some of the texts, so this is a nice passage. He says, "In a moment when clinging, identification, and grasping at inherent existence are pacified, there is the cessation of perception. The phenomena of the six senses do not appear at all. The Buddha stressed the importance of such cessation many times." So this is taken from a sutta. "That sphere should be understood where the eye ceases and perception of forms fades away, where the ear ceases and the perception of sounds fades away, where the nose and smells, tongue and tastes, body and etc. perception of tactile objects fades away. That sphere should be understood where the mind ceases and perception of mental phenomena fades away." Through letting go of clinging more and more totally and deeply, the world of experience fades and ceases, and seeing and understanding this is of great significance. I say that the end of the world cannot be known, seen, or reached by traveling, yet I also say that without reaching the end of the world, there is no making an end to dukkha, or suffering, or dissatisfaction. And this is taken from a book called Progress of Insight by Mahasi Sayadaw, a renowned Burmese meditation teacher. And he calls this cessation non-occurrence. And he says in the last phase of deep vipassana insight meditation, instead of falling upon that continuous occurrence, consciousness passes beyond it and alights upon non-occurrence, which is the very opposite of the bodily and mental formations called here occurrence. In other words, it arrives at non-occurrence, that is to say, it reaches, as if it alights upon, cessation, which is the stilling of the formations or conditioned phenomena. I think this is an amazing description of this, and I hope you can already see that the way that it's described by these practitioners, and perhaps by the Buddha himself, is very concrete, a very concrete experiential phenomena that one undergoes in deep contemplative practice. And I work with a lot of meditators in the lab who undergo these meditators regularly, as you'll see soon. And Nisargadatta, he's more from the Advaita Vedanta non-dual tradition of Hinduism, but he says something similar in different words. When you follow it up carefully from brain through consciousness to awareness, you find that the sense of duality persists. When you go beyond awareness, there is a state of non-duality in which there is no cognition, only pure being, which may be as well called non-being, if by being you mean being something in particular. He says, nothing is me is the first step. Everything is me is the next. Both hang on the idea, there is a world. When this too is given up, you remain what you are, the non-dual self. You are it here and now, but your vision is obstructed by your false ideas about yourself. So this is what I'm planning to talk about. The voluntary induction of absence or nothingness for the purpose of inner transformation and insight, and that this is central to enlightenment in these traditions. But I'm going to approach it in a very scientific way. We've had meditators who've gone into this state while we're doing various measurements to try to see what's going on. And something I'll talk about more as well is that this experience of nothingness isn't, it's not just for the experience of nothingness itself, but for the transformations it's said to make to the system, to the mind, and how the mind works subsequent to having deconstructed to such a state. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about cessation, specifically in the context of Buddhism and what that is, and then some experiments that we've conducted, including some preliminary data. It's really early days still in our analysis, but I have a little bit to share. And then some theoretical explanations for how such an experience is possible, how it arises, why it arises from a cognitive neuroscience perspective. Okay, so cessation. So a little bit of context how I came into researching cessation and becoming interested in this is I was living in Amsterdam at the time in this houseboat, and I was making friends with all of these meditators because I needed to get them in the lab, but I've also been involved in meditation for a long time. But I made a friend, his name's Marco, and he came over for some drinks one evening. And he started to tell me about this teacher that he has, who's based in Cambodia at the time, who is able to turn off his consciousness completely for up to 7 days and sit in this state of nothingness, for up to 7 days without eating, without using the bathroom, without moving at all. And I was naturally really skeptical that someone can do this, and it goes against many of my sort of presuppositions about biology and so on. But then he pulled out his phone and he goes, no, this is really legitimate. We even put one of these Muse headbands on him and had him go into one of these cessation states to see what happens to his neural activity. Now these Muse headbands are of course much more basic and crude than the things that we use in the lab. There's just a few electrodes where we use more than 100. But he showed me the data, and this is what he showed me. This is the actual image. So it's about 45 minutes of neural activity over time. So you have the different brain frequencies and their power presented there. But what you can see is something very interesting just here. And this little period here is exactly where he reported experiencing a cessation while he was meditating. And what that looks like is the brain flatlining, essentially. And so this I was also very skeptical. And I presumed it was something going wrong with the computation of the system. Maybe he was entering some unusual state, so it wasn't able to do the transformations that allow you to pull out these nice waves, because it's not that the brain looks exactly like that, But as also as a scientist, but also as a contemplative, this really made me really curious enough to follow this up a bit further. I talked to Helene about it, some other people in our lab who were also very skeptical but interested enough to have a conversation. So we made a Zoom call. We caught up with this meditator, and after that Zoom call that went on for about an hour, we were all basically convinced enough that we need to invest some resources in this and see if this is legitimate and see if we can find something, because the way he described this state mapped on really well to our understanding of how the mind constructs each moment in time. And it was grounded, and he seemed completely confident that he can do this in the lab, no worries, and willing to travel to do it. So that's where this whole thing began. Fast forward now 2 years, and we've just had accepted a paper on cessation in Progress in Brain Research and a volume on neurophysiology of silence. And this will be out soon, Cessations of Consciousness in Meditation, Advancing a Scientific Understanding of Nirodha Samapatti. Now we have a lot more work to do on this, but this is the first instantiation of it, where we're trying to basically introduce this phenomenon to the scientific field. We present some preliminary data from 2 different labs, and we try to have some really early ideas about how theoretically this is possible, given what we know about biology and the brain. So what is a meditation-induced cessation in Buddhist practice? And this is how we defined it in the paper. It's the absence of all experience and consciousness with no retrospective awareness of anything having taken place during the absence, accompanied by a subsequent profound sense of clarity, openness, and vitality. And now there's many ways that we can go unconscious that we're all familiar with. We can take general anesthesia. People can undergo seizures. Deep sleep is interesting also, except that it's different from cessation in the sense that we know that we've slept after we've slept, which there's none of this happens in this Nirodha Samapatti case, or Nirodha. We can have brain traumas, or other drugs like, for instance, ketamine can reliably make us unconscious, and we'll return to that a little bit later. But what's unique about the meditation-induced cessation of consciousness is that it's internally generated. In some cases, with very advanced meditators, they can voluntarily do this on demand within a few minutes. It results in a deep inner reset, or what's described as a deep inner reset. And when one returns to experiencing the phenomenological moment, it's much richer, much fresher, much more clear, as if seeing it for the first time, as if it not being bound by old models and beliefs. And there's this sense of clarity and openness and possibly flexibility and so on. We'll come back to that as well. In Buddhism, there are multiple uses for the word cessation, which is a translation of Nirodha. Sometimes it can refer to what we might call, especially in the Mahayana later tradition, something like a pure awareness event. There's problems with this because you also have these kinds of non-dual awareness, like reflexive awareness that can be present in ordinary life. I'm not going to talk about that now. I'm talking about something that's a state that has no contents, but also no, which I just changed to not no awareness. Can't necessarily say that it's an awareness, because when we say awareness, people think some sort of light consciousness, some sort of experience like this. It's really the nothingness, but it's not that they've gone unconscious. This is more like what was described in by Mahasi Sayadaw as the mind alights upon non-occurrence. Okay, so this is one thing, and we might call this Nirodha unconditioned, or Nirodha possibly even Nibbana. And then there's the absence of awareness event, which you could say is like a pure cessation, which is what I'm focusing on. And this is no contents, but also no awareness. So this is not really nothingness or some sort of event like that. This is really full-on absence for that period of time. And we might call this Nirodha unconscious. And actually in the path of Vipassana practice, often these two things come one after the other. Usually actually with the absence followed by the pure awareness, but it can change. And you don't necessarily need to have the full gap in consciousness to have this number one here. Whereas number one here is really important in Mahayana, but number two is very well recognized in the old canonical Buddhist literature. And this is what I'm going to focus on now. Conceptually much easier, it's very concrete, literally turning your mind off. In Buddhism, there's also two versions of this. The first is Nirodha, and this is short-lasting. It's like a cut or gap in consciousness, possibly lasting milliseconds or so. And that you have the changes in perception and cognition I mentioned. And this is associated with the culmination of the stages of insight in Vipassana meditation. So if you do Vipassana long enough and intensely enough, it eventually results in a cut in consciousness, which is correlated with the event of awakening, of the first stage of awakening. You need to go through this multiple times. This one in Buddhism, classical Buddhism, is actually the more important one in some way, because this is where the big transformation happens and one goes from being an ordinary human to being an awakened human and eventually being able to transcend life and death, theoretically. Now, the second one is Nirodha Samapatti, and cessation of perception and feeling, or cessation attainment. So this is an attainment in the sense that this is something that one who's almost either an partially enlightened anagami, so they've gone through this Nirodha process many times, passed through the stages of insight. This is a lot to take in, don't worry about it too much, but I'm just getting it out there. Nirodha Samapatti is an attainment that it's like a capacity that one develops after reaching a very advanced stage. But it's not particularly necessary to be able to do, but you can do it, and it's taught very concretely how to do it in the Buddhist literature, and there's people who do this, and I'll tell you about one of them shortly. But this can be short or long lasting, up to 7 days. So in the literature, in the Buddhist literature, the Buddha suggests you don't do this for longer than 7 days, because then you might die. So that's usually as far as people take it, but they could potentially choose to go longer. And this is more, sometimes it's compared to like a digital versus analog. And so Nirodha Samapatti is more like whoop, whoop, like a slow turning, a kind of gradual turning off and turning back on, whereas Nirodha is more like a digital cut in consciousness, but both are a form of cessation.
How do you know when it's 7 days if you have no awareness?
We'll come back to that. It's very interesting. It's one of the biggest problems of this capacity, assuming that it's real, right? But they train something. I'm going to tell you in a moment, otherwise I'll repeat myself. And it's an advanced capacity associated with the mastery of both Vipassana and Jhana. So Jhana is sort of the shamatha, tranquil meditation, sometimes translated focus meditation, not the best. We'll come to translation, but we'll come to that. And so you need to be able to progress through these stages of deepening concentration, serenity, tranquility, unification, which are called jhanas. And you also need to be a master of Vipassana meditation, i.e. you've gone through all the stages of insight and experienced these cuts in consciousness and the unconditioned and nibbana and so on. And then when you have mastery of both of these, and you're either an anagami or an arahant, partially enlightened or fully enlightened, then you can train yourself to do this Nirodha Samapatti thing, where you can just turn off your consciousness and turn it back on. And when you ask people why do you do this particular one, they say, well, it's just to show that you can. It's kind of a proof of your agency over your mind. You can say, if you can just turn it off and back on, then you've mastered your mind. You can say, this is really important for the transformations. This is, I don't really know what it's for, but it's a capacity that you can apparently train if you're developed enough. So this is a really important part of it. For some reason, both of these lead to this big sense of transformation in the system. In most cases, the first time one of these cessations happen, they say it leads to a permanent change in cognitive perceptual functioning. That sort of cycles through and gets deeper as one goes through the stages again, but each time there's this important transformation that happens, and that's also from cognitive neuroscience perspective an interesting problem to try to solve. So how is meditation thought to lead to cessation in Buddhism? So what is it about meditation in the context of Buddhism that is thought to actually result in this cessation? What's needed for this to actually happen? So to begin with, just the Nirodha version, so the short version. So this is said to happen because one, over practice, gains insight into the nature of experience, that it is impermanent, anicca, that it has no consistent self in it, and that grasping at it, or its nature, is in some sense suffering. the perspective that the ordinary mind takes on phenomena causes suffering. And it's this insight into the nature of experience that gradually leads to this unfabrication of reality, because somehow we're creating this moment through our desire for it, through our craving for it, but this insight gradually deconstructs this impulse, and this impulse to create this moment for our own survival, let's say. And so this leads to gradual letting go, deconstruction, or unfabrication of experience, which eventually leads to a brief cessation experience and what's called fruition or phala of the path of awakening. So somehow gaining insight into these Buddha's three characteristics leads to the system letting go of the subjective cosmos that we generate in each moment, which results in a cessation, which results in a rebirth in a new form, until eventually no rebirth at all. That's the idea. And this leads to a transformation of mind and a reduction in unwholesome mental factors or bad habits. And these are described in a lot of detail. So in the classical literature, they explain very concretely exactly which bad habits go away the first time that you have one of these cessations, the second time, the third time, and then the final time. It's explained in much detail which unwholesome habits of the mind disappear, and you're in a way meant to be aware of this yourself when you undergo them. Now, Nirodha Samapatti, this is the longer version. So how is this described? So this requires passing through the stages of insight at least 3 times, leading to the eradication of many bad habits, making one a anagami, a partially enlightened person, or an arahant, a fully enlightened person. Requires having mastery over both vipassana and all 8 jhanas, which I'll mention very briefly. I only added these into the talk just this morning because I thought you guys might be interested in based on the discussion so far. And may require determinations to refine ability to automatically physiologically track the passage of time. So this is something else that's trained, actually. So what they do to practice determinations in order to prepare for Nirodha Samapatti is they go into a meditation. They say, okay, I'm going to sit for 30 minutes. They set a timer, sit for 30 minutes, and then they check when they come out, did I hit exactly on 30 minutes? And then they keep on practicing this over and over and over again until they get very precise with their own physiological tracking of time. Now, we've all had experience of setting an intention to wake up in the morning at a certain time, and it kind of happens, right? So there seems to be some capacity to do this, but they get extremely good at this. And we did very briefly test this in the lab, and I'll mention that later. But I have to say, I also tried to train this in meditation. I've been really impressed with how accurate you can get, and it's not that hard. And it's pretty interesting, and something we want to do research further in the future. It requires setting an intention for the number of hours or days to remain in NS, an intention, Nirodha Samapatti, an intention to wake up in case of danger, and to know that they will not die during the state. Apparently very important. It requires also passing through all 8 jhanas, including the signless state, after which NS may occur. And so the Buddha compares this, what's the difference between Nirodha Samapatti and death? Good question to ask, apparently the Buddha thought, so he answered it. In the case of the one who is dead, who has completed his time, his bodily, verbal, and mental fabrications have ceased and subsided. His vitality is exhausted, his heat has subsided, and his faculties are scattered. But in the case of a monk who has attained the cessation of perception and feeling, that is Nirodha Samapatti, his bodily, verbal, and mental fabrications have ceased and subsided, his vitality is not exhausted, his heat has not subsided, and his faculties are exceptionally clear. So, cognition has ended, but the body remains in some sort of form. And there is explanation that there is some, that the breathing is meant to really eventually, in a longer period of this Nirodha Samapatti, that there should be very little breathing, the heart rate should really slow down to be almost imperceptible. And then there's historical anecdotes of people being in a state like that where they can't from the outside see or feel these physiological processes.
What does he mean by faculties?
That's a really good question, and I'm not exactly sure what is meant by faculties in this quote. Yeah. Okay, so I've mentioned the jhanas a few times, so I just want to present the formless jhanas very briefly. This could be several talks on its own. The formless jhanas happen after the first form jhanas. So as meditation deepens through these stages of tranquility, serenity, concentration, unification, the mind settles into deeper states of letting go, you could say. But after the first four, there's a transition from having sensory experience to not having sensory experience present anymore. That's why it's formless. It becomes formless in the sense that our usual sense of bodily sensory form is not present anymore in the four formless stages of meditation. And these are the four. The fifth one, after reaching a stage of equanimity in meditation, and all of these are based on this state of equanimity and building on that state of equanimity, one reaches infinite or boundless space as a state, then infinite boundless consciousness, then it's only stage 7 of, let's say, 9, or 10 if you include cessation, which is nothingness. So that's the experience of nothingness, which is not no-thingness in the cessation or non-occurrence in the cessation sense. And then there's what's very cryptically called neither perception nor non-perception, something kind of unidentifiable for the mind, let's say. And then there's something very interesting which doesn't get talked about a lot, which is the signless state, which some practitioners compare to a kind of non-dual awareness, a mind that simply goes out but doesn't land on anything. Just the source manifesting, the source of the mind manifesting onto nothing in particular. Or I've talked about with this some meditators, and they kind of agree with this. It's like a state of emptiness, not emptiness as a characteristic of things, but a state characterized by a sense of overarching emptiness. Then if you pass through the signless state, then happens cessation in the form of a true no awareness cessation or a kind of nibbana unconditioned event. Perhaps ideally both. Okay, that's what I have to say about what cessation is, and
Sorry,
yeah.
Could you just go back a bit?
I can.
And explain to me again what nothingness is.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess it's a state for them. It's a state in the meditation practice which best is described by this word nothingness.
Is it absolute nothingness?
No, no. It's really it's an experience of nothingness.
Yeah, I'm not trying to be.
No.
Genuine.
But when you say the word absolute, then I would say this absolute nothingness is either the unconditioned or the cessation.
Because it seems to me it's something and not
Right.
See,
Philosophically, I would say yes, but from a phenomenological standpoint,
okay.
I think they're just saying that this feels like nothingness.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? I have many questions. All right, so these are preliminary results. We're really actively analyzing data, and indeed I got some new data literally just this morning, which I managed to check in the slide, but I haven't even interpreted them myself yet very well. Whoops, what did I press then? Okay, so I'm going to tell you some data first on Nirodha Samapatti, and this was used with the meditator whom was brought up on the boat in the previous story. So he came to Amsterdam and spent a couple of days with us, and we did various experiments with him, and I'm going to just explain this in a kind of high level way. So we had 3 conditions. We had a resting state, where he just watched a nature documentary. We had to have him do something, because if you have him not do anything, he kind of goes into his meditation. Because you have to understand, but by the Buddhist definition, this guy is actually like a fully enlightened person, right? So his ordinary cognition is supposedly totally different to everybody else's. So, and then he does focused attention meditation for 35 minutes. Not then, randomized order. And then we have him go into this Nirodha Samapatti state also for 35 minutes. And then we do each of these conditions twice. Yeah. And then on another day, so this basically took all day. We had a documentary film crew there, and it was a whole ordeal. We had him do 90 minutes of Nirodha Samapatti, and then we had him take a nap. So we wanted to see, okay, if is it different to sleep? And then we had him 10 more minutes of just awake and resting state.
Meaning the nature documentary?
No, in this case he wasn't doing anything. He was just happened to be awake, and we were just recording during that time that he was awake but resting. Yeah. And I really want to give a big thanks to Professor Lucia Talamani and her lab, Stefan Vidushi, Yet, and Esther, who were master's students with me at the time, and for their contribution. This day 2 was done at the University of Amsterdam, the sleep lab that they generously let us use. And I circled this bit because I think we thought to do this like literally like half an hour before we were doing the test. We thought, hey, why don't you tell us when you're going into this Nirodha Samapatti, how long it will take you to go into this state of cessation, and then you come out of it after 90 minutes. We won't wake you up. You come out of it, and let's see how close you are actually to coming out at 90 minutes. And so he told us, okay, it's going to take me 10 minutes to get into it, and then I'll come out after 90 minutes. And we were pretty damn surprised to see that after practically exactly 90 minutes, we saw eye movements come back online. We saw his heart rate and respiration rate increase. And then about 5 or so minutes after that, he reported that he's awake now. So I mean, it's one data point, but it's promising.
This would be very useful for flights to Europe.
There's drugs for that, eh?
You need to patent it.
Okay, so we were so curious about this state. We thought, okay, let's just throw everything we can at him in terms of dependent variables, in terms of measures. Like let's just take everything, and hopefully we'll find something. So we had him plugged into all sorts of things. We had things measuring his breath, his movement, and well, let me just tell you everything we had. We were measuring neural activity using EEG and EMG. So eye movements, also heart rate, so things like BPM and variability, respiration in various ways, blood oxygen saturation, movement, skin conductance, temperature, and other indicators of nervous system activity using an ambulatory monitoring system, pre-ejection period, respiration, and vagal control. I'm not going to talk about basically any of those except the top one. We're still analyzing it, most of it, but I can tell you that it doesn't look very interesting. So physiologically, not much interesting going on. Now there's many, either it's just like, it just doesn't change physiology, but I'll mention something later. I don't know if I want to give the punchline to that yet, but it's likely that you need longer than 35 minutes to see big physiological changes, right? This is we're a homeostatic system. It takes time. If radical changes to the body happen like this, it's going to shock the system. It's not really possible. Things need to change gradually. Even if you think about things like hibernation or torpor, they take kind of days before these big changes in these bodily processes take place. So we really want to get him in the lab for a longer cessation, and we're working on trying to make that happen. Because after a couple of days, maybe we'll see some really radical things. And so while he was in these conditions on the first day, we also presented an auditory oddball task that I want to mention kind of briefly. So this is kind of a really a grounded task in cognitive neuroscience, where you basically just present a consistent stream of sounds and then a surprising sound. So beep, 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 boop. In this case, we did vowels. But basically what happens is that the brain starts to track the regularity, which is beep, 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 beep. And then when you get the boop, you get a surprise response in the brain. It gets a mismatch. That's called a mismatch negativity in the EEG. But this is something that's very easy to find even with one subject when you don't have them in for long. It's a very concrete thing. But it also shows up in things like comatose patients in deep sleep. It's a really robust measure. So we thought, it would be a kind of silver. It would be the big thing to find that this thing was modulated. This highly automatic tracking of regularities over time by the brain. If this was modulated, that's already like a huge finding. We didn't have much time with him, so we're like, okay, let's try this. And so we had 2,480 standard vowels and then 600 deviants in these different orders of vowels. And so the mismatch negativity is just a wave that's averaged over all the electrodes that you have on the EEG on the brain. And so you have these deviant responses, and then you have these standard responses in the brain, and then you take away the standards from the deviants, and then you get this mismatch negativity. So this is the response elicited as a cause of that, a result of the mismatch between the standard and the deviant. And this is the data, and the short story is here. The mismatch negativity did not change. I'll explain that in a second. But we didn't see any difference between focused attention, neurotisomapathy, and the resting state in the mismatch negativity. So what that suggests is that at least these early stages of processing in the brain that track regularities over time are still happening, even in the case of neurotisomapathy. So again, there's two possible interpretations for this. He wasn't actually in the state, like as described, or that even turning the system completely off the brain is continuing to track some things. I mean, it has to be doing some things because it's keeping the blood pumping, it's keeping the heart beating. So there has to be some tracking of regularities present anyway.
Maybe that's what faculties means.
That could be what faculties means, indeed. Yeah.
I mean, there's the autonomic sort of circadian system that has oscillators, and it's sort of neuro, but it's not conscious.
Yeah,
It's
no,
just-
exactly.
it could be-
I mean, most of the processes are indeed
Yeah.
unconscious, so I think there's still quite a bit going on. I could talk about this a lot because we can also do these hierarchical oddballs, regularities on top of regularities, and those are the things we would actually expect to start to break down, and we want to do that. But all of this is really tricky with single subject research. It's not really common with these kinds of paradigms that we're trying to use. So it's very tricky to get enough data and to do these kinds of studies. We also did try multivariate pattern analysis, which is to decode these differences, and we do see some stuff going on there, but I'm not sort of ready to talk about that yet. But the decoding, the AI sort of approach to it is a little bit better because you get a multivariate approach to all the electrodes. Long story. Okay, but what about the resting state EEG? What's happening to the brain regardless of perturbing it with these sounds? What's different between these states? So before I tell you that, it happened that at the same time as we were doing this in Europe, a group at Harvard, Matthew Sackett's lab, was also looking at neurodom in the context of meditation using EEG. So this is a paper also coming up pretty soon, Neurophenomenological Investigation of Mindfulness Meditation Fruition Experiences using EEG Network Analysis in an intensively sampled meditator. So also one very advanced meditator who I also know, and going through many of these cessations, also sometimes called fruitions. And what they particularly looked at in this study was functional connectivity. So this is a really good measure to try to use in this case. But basically what this functional connectivity is, if you haven't heard of it, is basically, the simple version is this the activity of this electrode correlated with the activity of this electrode, or this brain region with that brain region. Because if they're correlated, that suggests there's some shared information between them, right? Because the brain is an integrated system, it's not modular, right? It's all working together in some holistic way, and so there should be some correlations, and there in a normal functioning brain there are large correlations between different areas of the brain and their functioning, which then form these networks and so on. And so you can measure this in the neural activity to see what happens to the connectedness of different elements in the brain. I'm really glad they did, because I think that's an excellent measure for this. But they found some interesting things there. And they specifically pointed their predictions and their analysis on the alpha band, because that's where you see most of the changes in meditation historically. And so functional connectivity with using an average of 37 of these Neroda events over 80-second period, and so you have the actual fruition Nirodha event happening here at 0, and then they were collecting data from they were analyzing data from 40 seconds before to 40 seconds after. You can't collect data from the exact fruition moment because their head drops and they blink and you get all these artifacts so you have to remove sort of 1 or 2 seconds either side of the actual Nirodha, but then you can look at what's happening in functional connectivity over this period. And so this isn't an actual regression line, I just put this here because I didn't have time, but what you can see is something like this happening. It's been analyzed and it significantly decreases from time 1 to time 2 and then goes back up to normal. So you see very much this this pattern here. So it looks like functional connectivity in the brain sort of breaks down at this moment of cessation, which I think is really cool given the nature of deconstructive Vipassana practice where you actually start to separate your experience, and I'll talk about that in a little while. So we thought, since they just did this, can we replicate this finding with Nirodha Samapatti, the data that we have? And so we looked at functional connectivity for Nirodha Samapatti, the sleep and the resting state. So we already had this pre-processed and so on. And indeed what we found is that the sleep state had lower functional connectivity in the alpha band than the resting wake state, and that the cessation state was even lower than that. So we do seem to find the similar pattern in terms of functional connectivity breaking down as the state deepens. So both Nirodha and Nirodha Samapatti show a reduction in functional connectivity in the alpha band. And this was meant to be just a hint, but I actually now have a slide for this. Similar results seem to be present for spectral power. So they also found in a subsequent analysis that we're writing up now together that alpha power, the actual power of that frequency also decreases quite dramatically as a consequence of cessation. And I just got these results this morning, and I won't talk about them much. But what you can see is a few nice things. So the purple is always the meditation, the blue is always the sleep, and the orange is always the wakefulness. And so, if you look at the alpha band, you can kind of see this reduction of alpha band activity from wakefulness to meditation. You can see this in the theta band as well. You can also kind of see this in the sigma and in the beta band. Gamma band is a little less clear. And then in the really, really slow frequency waves that are associated with sleep, you can also kind of see, but there doesn't look like there's anything significant going on. So this data is still very preliminary. I didn't do this analysis, but I just wanted to show that there's obviously some pretty serious stuff going on, also just in the actual spectral power. Another thing mentioned was that for this particular person, spectral power on average is also way lower than average people that they have in the lab. So this sort of stood out as well. All right, so that's the experiment. So that's a bit about what cessation is, a little bit about the preliminary data that we have, and this is going to be a whole process of unpacking all of the stuff that we've collected and more experiments that are coming. What about theoretically? What could be going on with this very strange phenomena? So in 2021, we published this paper called From Many to None or One, Meditation and the Plasticity of the Predictive Mind, where we basically paint a picture of how the meditation path, an integrative theory of how meditation works from the perspective of predictive processing or active inference models of the brain. So this is kind of, for the first time, have a relatively convincing overarching model of how the brain organism works for the first time, and it's broadly within different names: predictive processing, predictive coding, active inference, free energy principle. There's nuances between them, but they're kind of pointing to the same theory. I don't have time to explain that whole theory. I'll tell you elements of it as we go. But we take this theory and we basically explain the stages of meditation from this experience of having like a rich, ordinary moment all the way down to one of these nothingness experiences or cessations. Actually, we don't specifically talk about cessation in this paper. We talk about non-dual awareness as that sort of unconditioned state, because we only really got interested in the cessation thing when we discovered this meditator. So that's what this other paper adds to this one. But the basic ideas underlying this theory paper is that the brain constructs, there's kind of two premises. The brain constructs our model of the world self in the present moment hierarchically in levels of abstraction. Okay, so this moment, including all our thoughts, experiences, feelings, sensations, and so on, all of it is constructed in each moment through levels of abstraction. And we can see those levels in the brain, and you can test them in time and so on. There's lots of ways that you can see this, and I think it's one of the most robust overarching findings in cognitive neuroscience that exist. And then that meditation gradually deconstructs abstract hierarchical processing until all abstract processing falls away. So in each moment, the brain is creating this moment through levels of abstraction, and then meditation gradually reduces them. And then what's interesting is when you map the stages of meditation as they're described in many traditions, you get a beautiful mapping between how neuroscientists talk about the brain constructing this moment versus how the meditation deconstructs it from a phenomenological perspective. They map on extremely well. So just want to say a few more things about this. So the way this hierarchical abstract levels works is you have this concrete data of the senses somehow impinging upon the body, right? And this is like basically all that the brain has to model the world out there. I mean, it can't see anything out there. It has to somehow project it out there through two-dimensional impressions on the body, right? On the retina or from within. It's not there. It has to project it somehow. So basically, all it has to deal with is these sensory impressions. And so the common idea is that we take these sensory, kind of intuitive ideas, that we take these sensory impressions in, and it's through that processing inwards that we're over layers able to construct this moment. But this new way of looking at it is that we infer it instead. We predict it. We predict each moment in time. That's what keeps us agile and allows us to keep track in time and respond fast enough. We don't take it in and build the model each time fresh. We project it, we guess it into reality, and then we just update our model when we make errors. So we just project this out there based on our past experiences and our expectations, given the past moments that have happened, conditioned by the past. And we generate this moment and we update that when we make mistakes. I mean, you can kind of intuitively get a sense for this when you see something out of the corner of your eye, it looks one way, and then you look at it and suddenly it transforms into something else. Like if you start to pay attention to your perception, these kinds of remodeling phenomena are happening all the time. And then you get these levels of abstraction. So, you know, because it has to model many levels. So it's not just, because there's a concrete sensory experience that it needs to model, which is like the let's say the statistical regularities of color and light and edges and lines and so on. But from that, we need to then build like, okay, this is an object as separate from other objects. So that's another level of abstraction, and then you can see that, okay, these particular lines and edges and so on go together to form this thing that I'm willing to call a cup, right? And so that's another, not a cup, a bottle. I usually have a cup when I give this example. And so that's another level of abstraction. And then I can also talk to you about cups and experiences that I've had with cups or bottles in the past and in the future. So now we're going up levels of abstraction even further until we're fully in the domain of higher order abstract thinking when I can talk about the infinite past and the infinite future. And each of these levels are built from, each of these levels have prediction error minimization going on. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail for now, but each level is trying to predict basically the input of the level below. So this guessing game is happening at each level of abstraction in the brain. And as I said, this is based thought to be like going from concrete to abstract, but it's also in time. So the early layers happen first, and the later layers happen later. So you can think about it in terms of abstraction, in terms of time, in terms of depth of processing in the brain. So how deeply has it been processed in the brain? The deeper it's processed in the brain at different stages of processing, for example, from early stages of visual processing, V1 in the cortex, going to later regions, V2, V3, so on, and then into the temporal regions, so on. All of this is deeper stages or more abstract processing. That's where you also start to see language, default mode network, all of these kinds of things you might have heard of. You also see this in the EEG response. So basically, like if I present a stimulus, let's say a word, the early stages are associated with the early sensory responses. A few hundred milliseconds later, you get task-dependent categorization, so categorization of the bottle. Then you get working memory encoding, so encoded with, you're able to hold it in your memory, you can choose responses, and then you can even have emotional reactions to the word once you've comprehended it and so on. And so you get all of these laid out in time. And this was another very nice study that highlighted these levels of abstraction using 17,000 experiments, or 1/4 of the whole fMRI literature, and in using machine learning algorithms in a bottom-up way. They were able to identify, using 17,000 experiments, these levels of abstraction based on network depth of processing. But it's basically just saying what I already said: incoming sense data increasing with greater abstraction up to reasoning, naming, concepts, language, and imagination. That's a very cool paper to read if you're interested in these levels of abstraction. But basically what they conclude is that these algorithms revealed an objective hierarchical landscape of cognition in the brain with awareness at its structural core, and all results defined solely by computational analysis, largely devoid of human bias. But I don't need to rely on that paper. Basically every journal that we care about has published something about these levels of abstraction in the brain, and it doesn't matter also what sensory stream the researchers are in, they find a similar process. Speech is an excellent one, because to make sense of what I'm saying, you have to integrate it over time and create these levels of abstraction, because to hear what I'm saying, you have to get the letter sounds, then you have to get the syllables, you have to get the words, you have to string them together with other words, you have to make sentences to listen to a whole talk, and you have to put these all together over time, and it's tracking these regularities over time that maps onto the abstraction. So all of these things kind of come together in this one way of explaining it. Again, in speech, also visual processing, also predictions and prediction errors. You get hierarchies, and you can also disrupt the hierarchical processing in different states of consciousness. So for example, in deep sleep, you don't find as abstract processing in the brain. You see that this abstract processing starts to break down to some extent. Lots of computational work as well. Now, the last thing I want to add about this is that we can also think about these levels of abstraction as levels of selfhood. And as many people have talked about this, Sean Gallagher, Friston, Carhart Harris, Anil Seth, Finkelkirch, and others. But in our paper, we chose these three as levels of abstraction, different levels of abstraction. So at the top you have the narrative self, and this is all our abstract thoughts and memories about ourselves in the past and future. That's essentially our narrative, our story, our thoughts about ourselves. You can say that's part of who we are. Then we also have our experiencing embodied self at a lower level of abstraction. That's what we experience in this present moment, or what we take to be the present moment. Our present sensory experience of our body and what's happening here. And there's a kind of, you could say that there's a kind of selfhood in our experiencing way of being. Then there's also, I think, even more fundamental form of selfhood, which is this capacity to witness. So I have my thoughts and beliefs about myself. I have my embodied experience of this moment, but I'm also able to witness my embodied experience of this moment, right? So there's these levels, and you could say that these levels of self map onto levels of abstraction in the brain as well. Although they all kind of necessitate each other in the sense that you need the witnessing for the experiencing, for the narrative. And perhaps number 4 there, as you'll see, is that nothingness, that source from which this whole this hierarchy of selves emerges. So the brain constructs our model of the world self and the present moment hierarchically in levels of abstraction. Now meditation gradually deconstructs abstract hierarchical processing until all abstract processing falls away. So to describe how this happens, I'm going to draw on 3 core styles of meditation that have been sort of categorized in the cognitive neuroscience literature, try to make sense of all these different meditation practices that people do and try to see, okay, these are common characteristics, let's put these together as styles. And I'll describe those now. So the first is focused or unified attention practice. So this is what people usually start with when they first begin meditating. So this is kind of like almost, you kind of get to experience the journey a little bit of how this deconstruction works. So with focused unified attention, you first bring your attention to some object of meditation, something that's kind of in our present experiential reality. That can be, a breath or some part of the body. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is that you just bring your attention to one thing that's happening now, and you just keep it there. And if ruminations, abstract thinking happens, you ignore that and you come back to one object of the present moment. It's a very simple practice. This is kind of classic breath meditations, yoga, mantra, some forms of metta, and also potentially some forms of prayer, associated with shamatha practice in Buddhism. Then you have open monitoring, and so in this, you tend to different extents depending on the practice, but you open up that scope of attention. And the key here is that you don't anymore have a preference about what's arising. You're not saying, I'm going to pay attention to this in particular so much, to this. It's non-preferential, non-judgmental observation of whatever is arising in this present moment. So you're letting go of that tendency to grasp attention and put it somewhere else and categorize and so on, right? So you're letting go of that level of abstraction. And so whatever arises, thoughts arise, doesn't matter. You release that for this sort of open monitoring. And so sometimes you can have a kind of object of meditation, but it's much lighter, it's much more non-preferential, not judgmental, and open. And so this is associated with mindfulness, for example, Vipassana practice in some of its forms, sometimes labeling of experience, so some practices utilize that. Meta-awareness practices, and emphasizes this sort of relaxed, open, non-judgmental, non-evaluative quality. So that's open monitoring, and this is where it gets a bit more esoteric. So these are the non-dual practices. So here the instructions get very tricky, because in a sense there's an open scope of attention, but in a more profound sense there's actually a dropping of attention altogether. So there's a relaxation of attention from any phenomena at all, including any of the bodily phenomena, and it's replaced with a recognition of that awareness which is kind of underlying the whole experience already. So it's not putting attention on anything, because that's an abstraction, right? There's something grabbing the attention, putting it on something, right? There's a lot of abstraction going on there, so you're going even deeper than that to release all abstract processing, particularly the sense that there's an I observing an object, by just recognizing the awareness that's already present underlying all of those other stages of meditation. So in a sense, the non-dual also recognizes that those previous stages were all just already non-dual, right? So this is, for example, Shikantaza in Zen tradition, self-inquiry in many traditions, but also Advaita Vedanta, Murukaba in Sufism, Mahamudra and Dzogchen quintessentially in Tibetan practice. And William James actually had something to say about these non-dual experiences, and he coined the term chusness, which he described as an awareness preceding consciousness that is without subject or object. So we could say con is like contents, but it's just chusness, is without subject or object. He also described an experience he called the syncope during inhalation of nitrous oxide. And he said, during the syncope, there is absolute psychic annihilation, the absence of all consciousness. Then at the beginning of coming to, one has at a certain moment a vague, limitless, infinite feeling. So you could say a cessation, then a return. A sense of existence in general without the least trace of distinction between the me and the not me. And then, you could say that he underwent something like a nirodha, I'm not sure, but either way, after this sort of non-dual experience, then there's also the possibility of this nirodha. So we didn't cover this in our paper, but we did in that second cessation paper. And so you progress through focused attention, through to open monitoring, through to non-dual, and then cessation. And each one of these gradually reduces abstraction in the brain, going from reducing the thinking self, the narrative self, letting go of the experiencing self by stopping judgment and evaluation of sensory experience, and then letting go of the subject-object distinction until it all drops away. And now it's really interesting, because if you think about this idea of the present moment, now the present moment isn't your experiencing self. The present moment is non-existence. It's going beyond existence and non-existence. It would be more accurate, because the present moment, to truly be in the present moment, means to not integrate information over time, and the brain needs time in order to model anything, to have any experience. To be truly in the present moment is actually to drop out of the whole stream of consciousness, actually. So people think they're practicing mindfulness and it's going to make them feel good and so on, but actually they're going to bottom out at some point and disappear. but this is the model in a little bit more detail. So focused attention first increases the precision. This is a technical concept within the predictive processing system I won't explain, but it's can be equated with attention here. Of present moment sensory experience, so you bring the thinking self down through focused attention into the sensing domain, experiencing self. This decreases abstraction in the overall hierarchy of abstraction. Open monitoring or vipassana decreases evaluation and precision of sensory content through bare or unconditional observation. So you're letting go of that evaluation, that judgment, and this brings one into a kind of pure witnessing pure subjectivity. And then from this domain, non-dual meditation deconstructs even this very basic assumption of the subject-object dichotomy to reveal this sort of pure, unconditioned state that you can call awareness, or awareness again has its problems because it brings to mind things. It's really hard to picture it, but it's the unconditioned, that beyond being and non-being. Now from a scientific perspective, why does Nirodha potentially occur? Why does a cessation in consciousness occur if you take this meditation far enough? If you go up to this non-dual state, why does eventually potentially Nirodha occur? Well, somehow through a release of this inference of pure awareness, let's say, somehow even that basic inference, that groundless ground of existence, even that can somehow come to an end. Interesting in the Buddha's teaching, it's also that there is no self anywhere. There is nothing is to be reified that includes the unconditioned. Somehow the system has to go beyond also reification of this unconditioned element of experience. And well, cessation in some logical sense is revealing of that. But we could look at here at Thomas Metzinger's theory of minimal phenomenal experience as a way to understand consciousness. So what is the most basic form of experience, the most minimal form of experience, which is these pure awareness experiences. And so his model of what this minimal phenomenal experience may be is that it's a model, let's do it like this. So experiences of awareness have many of the same qualities as pure wakefulness. So somehow the system has to wake itself up, let's say from deep sleep, for instance. Somehow the brain, the cortex, has to have a signal that actually arouses it into wakefulness. And we do have that system. It's called the ascending reticular activating system, which is responsible for arousing the cortex and hence giving rise to wakefulness. Interestingly, there's a Tibetan teacher, I forget his name now, but he says his term for the non-dual state is wakefulness beyond accepting, pure wakefulness beyond accepting and rejecting, which is interesting. And anyway, Thomas proposes that pure awareness is a model that the brain is making of this pure wakefulness signal, this arousing signal that is coming into the brain. So pure awareness is a model of this ARAS signal prior to further, deeper, or more abstract representation. So all abstract processing has stopped, but when all abstract processing has stopped, all you have is this sort of pure energy response. There's just the energizing of the brain itself. And so at some point, if you stopped all abstract processing, all that you would have in the system is this energizing signal. And when you, let's say, represent that, then what you get is the phenomenology of pure wakefulness or pure consciousness, pure awareness. Yeah. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, where did I? Okay. So cessations, I'm just about finished. Cessations in meditation is the final release of this ARAS model leading to an absence of awareness. That's one. I'm not saying I buy this, but this is one sort of one way to say why this happens if you keep meditating. This is another hypothesis I sort of came up with for the previous paper, and this is the disintegration hypothesis very quickly. So if you know the information integration theory of consciousness, Giulio Titononi proposes or suggests that underlying the unity of experience must be causal interactions among certain elements within the brain. This means that these elements work together as an integrated system, which is why their performance, unlike that of a camera, breaks down if they are disconnected. So consciousness is always a singular, unified phenomenon. And you need, and it seems to be from a neural perspective that you need integration of information in order to get a coherent conscious experience, because all the senses are coming in from different places and they're in different times, and they have to be put together to give a unified conscious experience. So this seems a key characteristic, a fundamental characteristic of consciousness. Now, deep levels of meditation actively deconstruct and separate bound aspects of experience. So you literally, in deep states of meditation, deconstruct and separate phenomenology of different parts of what is usually a unified experience. So, going through this a little bit quickly, but this top-down deconstruction may lead to an inferential failure to bind experience into a coherent, unified whole. You're actively gathering evidence against the idea of this unified consciousness through your introspective practice of deconstruction, which could disintegrate the neural processes and actually lead to a breakdown of consciousness. Since consciousness is always a singular unified phenomena, to disunify experience actually results in unconsciousness. So this ought to be evidenced by breakdown in connectivity and or synchrony in neural activity similar to analgesics and anesthetics. And again, what did we find? We found exactly that. So we found a breakdown in alpha band phase lag index, which is a measure of connectivity, and we replicated this in two universities. And interestingly, similar breakdowns in connectivity is found with both general anesthesia and ketamine-induced unconsciousness. So this breakdown in normal synchronization may indicate an impairment in cortico-cortical communication and thus a failure to bind together elements of a coherent conscious experience. And actually I'm going to end the talk there, but there's other things we can talk about if you want, which is, for example, how is it that this leads to an inner reset and all this profound clarity? I have an idea for why that happens, and I can explain that to you with nice figures and everything like this. I have it all worked out, you see, so that's all sorted. Also, okay, final thing. What is the evolutionary imperative for being able to do this? I sort of mentioned it before. This is a very sort of speculative idea that we're exploring, and I don't know if this image already gives away the idea, and I mentioned it previously, but there's similarities here to hibernation or torpor. Of course, there's this sudden sense of renewed energy, and that is the purpose of these things. There are long periods of immobility. They're practiced in caves. Very interesting, right? Physiological changes is to be confirmed because we really need a longer neurodevelopmental party to be able to compare these things, but that would really be what we need to see to really make this comparison to hibernation or torpor. And that's the talk. A big thanks to Professor Helene Slagter and many others who helped with this project. Thanks for listening.
Behind, but yeah, maybe just a couple of quick questions. Yeah,
Thanks, Ruben. Fascinating. I don't know where to start.
Me neither.
I'll start with the kind of disintegration idea, right? So I wonder what you think about this. Under psychedelics, we see reduced alpha power. We also see arguably all kinds of unbinding as characteristic of the experience. And then by all accounts, we see increased or intensified consciousness, at least if you want to take phenomenological reports. So what gives?
Yeah, look, I don't know. Well, my first impulse with answering that, and I want to think about this more, because that came to my awareness very recently that those same results are found in psychedelics. But my first impulse is that this active separation of phenomenology and meditation is greater or deeper or more fundamental than what happens in psychedelics. So I think there is a disintegration in psychedelics, but it doesn't start to touch on these really fundamental building blocks. So I think those very fundamental building blocks are still being integrated and put into some sort of unity. Even though it's very entropic, there's some integrated thing being found there in psychedelics that doesn't happen at these really fundamental stages of meditation. Because in the meditation, you first, to reach the cessation, you first already slowed down like all abstract processing. You're not even having sensory experience anymore. You're like way beyond that. And then you're still deconstructing any small tidbit that arises, you're recognizing its emptiness, you're recognizing its anicca anatta, you're separating it, the aggregates they're called, you separate those, and then you get this. Whereas in psychedelics, you're having all these wild experiences, but your abstract processing hierarchy is fully present. So there's one thing there. It depends on the state in psychedelics.
Not always, yeah. I mean, I guess the point is then that the explanation would have to be in terms of unbinding of something specifically, because there isn't just a general correlation of unbind, get less consciousness.
That's a very good
point. Looks
point.
like the more you unbind, the more consciousness you you get in psychedelics.
But maybe if you go far enough also with the psychedelic unbinding, you do get this sort of, and I've heard of this happening to people. I think it's rare. It's much rarer than these sort of unity experiences to have something, one of these non-occurrence experiences, but it does happen.
No, I reckon it does.
Yeah.
And then you have with, this is the last thing I'll say, with ketamine, of course, you get psychedelic until you have enough that you get general anesthesia.
I recently had to have ketamine in a ambulance in Amsterdam because of a back thing, and amazing.
I recommend.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah. I don't know who's next.
Loads of questions appearing. Jim was first.
Just a simple. You said that as you approach the Nirodha, that you move from the abstract, the levels of abstraction fade away, and you get down to the point where you can't make imagery anymore because images are dissolved or consciousness fragments from its normal functions. I understand your answer to the question about psychedelics, but what about at the moment of death? It would seem to me that when you're dying, that's when you get closest to the de-unification of consciousness. But in fact, the people who are dying report these very vivid imageries, which are at the highest levels of abstraction. Have you any data? I mean, I don't know how you take data on somebody that's going to die, but
near-death experiences maybe.
yes, near-death experience, for example.
Well, at different stages of the meditation process, you have things that happen that look like those, like near-death experiences. You have all this unity consciousness, you have pure consciousness, pure nothingness, pure space. You have all these fascinating things that can unfold. Encounters with other beings, and all of these things are reported by many meditators who have gone, deep enough there. It does happen, but all of that also needs to be deconstructed. So one thing that's also described in the sutras is that in order to get to this cessation, to awakening, the system has to release all the levels of existence, including craving for heavenly states. The heavenly states, these are all explained in these traditions, but you have to recognize that there is some, if not subtle, form of suffering, anicca, anatta, dukkha, present at all levels of even the most heavenly near-death experiences. There's something that needs to be released there, and that's what the practices aim to do. And it's only after that you can get this cessation. But interestingly, also in these texts, they describe that if you, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but if you've had, one cessation, you're sort of bound to have the next cessation at least at death, because death is going to give you the opportunity to get to the next stage. So death is associated at least with a really important time where having those experiences are possible. But I think, at least from their models, that it would be something beyond near-death experiences. Yeah.
Maybe one more quick question from Nathan, and then we'll have a 10-minute break.
I was just wondering if you could say more about evolution and hibernation.
What can I say about that? I'm not an expert on hibernation. I'm sort of slowly learning about it, and there's a lot of difference between animals, how much their physiology changes. It's usually, for example, smaller animals that have really dramatic changes in their physiology. Other animals like bears have less dramatic changes in their physiology, but it does change a lot. Heart rate slows right down, temperature slows right down, respiration slows right down. It's used as a way to conserve energy over periods where there's not enough energy input from the environment. And some animals do this for short periods. So, for example, in the case of torpor, is usually like a short form of hibernation. Hibernation is a longer form version. You can go into torpor just as some animals, instead of sleeping, I think they basically go into torpor. But we have common ancestors, not too far in the distant past, who were hibernators. So there's good reason to believe that we still possess the genetic potential for hibernation. And I think there was also recent. So the reason I would have said this if I got the chance. I was in that house, but I was living with an archaeologist who's one of my best friends, and he overheard that initial Zoom conversation that we were having with this guy. And immediately when I got off the Zoom conversation with him, he's like, "Hey, that's hibernation." So that's where that whole thing started. Is because he pointed out this, and then another researcher that we're working with, Henk Barendrecht, he also, and he's someone who actually undergoes these experiences, but he said he also came up with the hibernation idea independently, and so they were like, okay, we need to actually start thinking about this, and we've been trying to look whether there are similarities there. I mean, I think biologically it's plausible, and it's the closest thing I can imagine from an evolutionary perspective to explain this state, but I don't think the evidence is there yet.
We need to go into some caves and measure the bears.
Yeah.
You first.
And also, but I just find it hilarious that they do go into caves to practice these things, right? Like that just to me is so striking. Even though it's like scientifically it's kind of ridiculous, but it's just so, I don't know. That's it. Yeah. Thank you guys.